Welcome back. This is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It. This week we have another author on the show, Tom Fischgrund. He wrote Trump's Second Term, What If President Donald J. Trump Had Won Reelection in 2020. This is speculative fiction, of course, luckily, that predicts a chain of events leading to a more and more despotic kind of tyrannical presidency under Trump. And while dark, it's pretty lively and compelling, and it shows a number of flaws and strengths in our democratic process. During the show, we discussed Trump, fact stranger than fiction, and this being a really difficult problem when you're trying to write something like speculative realism. We discussed Putin and Russia, we discussed China, and the overall thorny problem that we find ourselves in. I hope you enjoyed the interview. Hello, this is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It. Today we're on air with Tom Fischgrund, and he just wrote a fantastic book, and we're going to sort of cover that. And the premise is really Trump having a second term. Tom, would you like to first off introduce yourself, tell us where you're coming from, and then launch into your sort of the idea or the inception that drove you to make the book?
Well, thank you, Ryder. Very happy to be here. This was a book that kind of grew out of, what would happen if Trump were reelected for a second term? And, I wrote this over a year ago, a year ago, February. And during, 2020, Trump was behind. I mean, he was behind anywhere from 12 to 8 points behind Biden. And, the question was, is there any possibility that he could be reelected? And, and then I thought back, well, geez, if you go back to 2016, Hillary Clinton was up by 17 points and Trump still won. So there was always the possibility that Trump could be reelected. And the question is, well, what would a second Trump term look like? And to many of us, that was frightening. And my friends said, God, that's dystopian fiction. But I said, hey, guys, this is realistic. And as I looked at the election last fall, Trump came a lot closer than people thought. In fact, there was one of his pollsters had said, I think in October, he said, Trump, here's what you need to do. First of all, get off the election fraud. Stop telling people don't vote over the mails because that's going to depress your vote. And the second, take ownership of the coronavirus. And if you take ownership of it and say, we're going to have a strong program, that would have diffused part of Biden's argument. And the third thing was that if Trump had done better in his first debate with Biden and not just kind of been Looney Tunes, we might have now been talking about President Donald J. Trump in his second term.
Yeah.
And as I looked at this, a final thing was I looked at the numbers, and even though Biden won by 7 to 8 million votes, if 104,000 votes in 4 states had switched, just 104,000 out of 155 million had switched, it would have been President Trump. So looking at this, I said, okay, well, it is a real possibility. And especially, when I was writing this in the spring, this was just at the beginning of the coronavirus. And and the economy looked good. The market was up. Unemployment was down. And I was watching and I was reading Hugh Hewitt saying, here's the reason Donald Trump's going to be elected. Here's why we should reelect him. And I'm saying, oh my God, well, what would happen? And so what I did was I kind of sat down and thought, okay, what would this mean in terms of the economy? What would this mean in terms of social justice? What would this mean in terms of the pandemic? And then carry it to logical conclusion. And probably the only mistake that I made, or the only thing that, is that I probably wasn't crazy enough. I think, you look at this, and I was saying, okay, well, I'm going to think of some really crazy things that Trump will do. And, kind of as I reread it, what rational, logical person who's president would encourage followers to go to the Capitol on January 6th and say, hey, we need to prevent a vote from happening. If I'd written that in the book, people would have said, oh my God, this is crazy.
Yeah.
This is Looney Tunes. This isn't going to happen. So, you need. So what I did was I tried to make the book as realistic as possible and take what Trump was doing in his first 3 years and say, let's logically extend this the next years. And that's what I did.
Yeah, it has been interesting because, of course, at first Trump was comedy gold for like SNL or Comedy Central, right? And then after a while, you just that truth stranger than fiction kind of thing, you can't predict it anymore. And they were almost talking about you can't even make jokes about it because there's always something in reality that trumps the joke the next week. And there does seem to be a situation there that I've been kind of thinking about in terms of a lot of things, the way society works, but this inability for people to sort of hold on to, I don't know, there's something about this fictionalized nature, right? That he's a character, that he's making a lot of mistakes, but they sort of also agree that, he's competent. Roughly half the population assumes that he's doing great, or they wouldn't have voted for him, or at least this is the voting population. And so the fact that he got so close in so many ways is signaling to me that there are people out there that actually do believe everything he was doing was great and that it was actually moving forward. And in my mind, that feels like believing the hype, right? Like if he says he's great often enough, then people will believe he's great. And this, I don't know, this makes me despair a little bit.
Well, having people believe the hype, but also people kind of had the feeling that Trump wasn't great, and some of my friends are Trump supporters, former friends, and and I said, really? And they said, but yeah, it's so much better than having those socialist Democrats. And there were two people that just amazed me. One was Mick Mulvaney, who was Trump's chief of staff, and Mick Mulvaney said, Trump was responsible for the insurrection, and he came out and admitted it. And God, I was shocked. I was amazed that somebody that close to Trump. But then at the same time, they asked him, "Would you vote for Trump again in 2024?" He said, "Yeah, absolutely."
Mm.
And I'm saying, kind of, there's a disconnect. A sitting president attempts to overthrow the government, and yet somebody says, "Well, I'm going to vote for him next term." And the same thing with Boehner. Boehner was very critical of Trump, and then they said, "Who'd you vote for in 2020?" He goes, "Trump." So, to me, there is a disconnect. But
Well,
the other thing, one of the things is, you talk about how crazy Trump is, and I remember sending a memo to an email. We've got an email chain to one of my friends, and I was saying there were three things Trump did today in one day that any one of them from Obama or Clinton or Bush would have been said, hey, what is this person out of his mind? The first one was Trump praised QAnon supporters and saying, that he likes them very much. He appreciates their support. And I'm thinking, you want white supremacist supporters? The second thing he said in the same day was that his former one of his aides at the Department of Homeland Security said Trump wanted to swap Puerto Rico for Greenland. I mean, if I had written that in a book, you would have said, what, you're crazy. That's never going to happen. And the third thing that really that was most troubling was when Wallace, the Fox News reporter, asked him, "Will you accept the election results if you don't win?" And he couldn't answer that. He said he didn't say, "Yeah, of course I'm going to accept it." Mm-hmm. Every other candidate, major candidate, has always said that. He refused to say that. That was one day.
Yeah.
QAnon, Greenland, and I won't accept the election. One day.
Well, and what's also funny is because he talks so much, he says so many things, and they're contradictory. That I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was a guy that was pretty right-leaning, and he was saying, he goes, Trump always said that he was going to try every legal avenue, and then he would step down. And I was like, when did he say that, right? And so there becomes these alternate narratives, and that's what was so fascinating about your book, right? Is it's a kind of a predictive future, but what we're also watching happen is even in the current moment, people are generating their own alternate narratives. They're unwriting the things that Trump said, and they're just choosing something else and saying, well, this was his intention.
I'm laughing because another reporter at one point asked Trump what kind of grade. Oh, it was Woodward. Asked Trump, what kind of grade would you give yourself for the pandemic? And this was after 230,000 people had died. Mm. And Trump's response was, I think I'd give myself an A. I think I would. And so, you're logically expecting, well, maybe give yourself an A, maybe a B, maybe a C. But his next comment was even more amazing, was where he said, depending on how it goes, I might give myself an A plus. So the choice was not between A and B or A and C. It was between A and A plus. And, in my book, what I tried to do was try to say, okay, what would happen? And for example, one of the things that I'm absolutely sure would happen there would be protests, and there would be massive protests, general strikes, and they would be less around racial equality because Trump would just bury that. They would be more about, we need to stop this megalomania, this despot, this authoritarian. We need to stop him. And then how would Trump respond? And, forgetting the Constitution, forgetting democracy, forgetting everything else. And Trump's response had been like it was during the summer when he wanted to visit that church across the street, and he calls out the National Guard and they fire on, protesters. In the book, I said, well, what would Trump do? And you got to remember that in Trump's second term, in Trump's first term, he did a lot of things where he said, well, I'll just see what I can get away with. In his second term, he would say, I have a mandate. And whatever he did in his first term, you would have to kind of double and triple that because he would act with impunity.
Yeah, so I think there's two things I want to get into. There is, one of them is a lot of your characters have a driving interest, right? Some of them are self-interested, some of them are more outward-looking, some of them change, it seems like, because of their self-interest. Like what happens in their life circumstances changes their focal point. And then one of the other things that we can jump into, maybe after we discuss that, is how this sort of mirrors some of the things that Putin has done in Russia, right? How there's a playbook for this kind of behavior to collapse a democracy.
The characters in the book, people got to, in Trump's America, everybody needs to take sides. Mm. So the people that support Trump, I think, have two motivations. Their first motivation is they really do believe that the country is better off with lowering taxes for the wealthy, maintaining the status quo, etc. So I think they have a fundamental belief. At the worst, it's kind of the worst instincts that people have, and at the best, you get a Mitt Romney, a John McCain, who truly believe that there is a conservative ethos that's good. But I think the second thing is that everybody acts in their self-interest. And, people that kind of go, there are a few people, such as Kelly, who was chief of staff, who said, the reason I did it and the reason I stayed so long is that if I left, it'd be worse.
Right.
But most people are thinking, I'm going to stay in power. And those are the Lindsey Grahams and the Ted Cruz of the worlds and the Josh Hawleys who say, I want to maintain power. And the way that you maintain power is you support whatever the president does. And the minority speaker who goes down to kind of pay homage to Trump after the insurrection, that's a perfect example of somebody that's going to do anything to stay in power. On the other side, the people that are against Trump are obviously hate his anti-democratic moves. They hate the fact that he, in the second term, he probably used the National Guard. The fact is that he doesn't care about social justice, et cetera, et cetera. They have that firm belief too. But, there's one character in the book who kind of undergoes a transformation. And the transformation is that he is an executive in Atlanta for a financial services firm, and he's doing well. He's making a couple $100,000. He's living in Buckhead, and hey, life is good. And even though his wife and his kids are saying, yeah, but Trump's against immigration or health care, there are a lot of people that aren't doing well. Poverty's growing up, etc. And he's saying, but we're doing fine. And the transformation becomes as first of all, as the economy gets worse over time, and I predicted it would, because Trump would not handle the pandemic correctly, wouldn't do nearly what Biden is doing, that he loses his job. And then he goes from being pro-Trump to, well, maybe this is only temporary, to the fact that then, as Trump becomes more and more despotic, he then decides, okay, that he's against Trump, and he goes on a protest rally, and he goes with his kids, and then his kids get arrested, and all of a sudden, then at that point, he becomes very, very anti-Trump, because now it's personal.
Right, right. And I think that was, that kind of phrase, to make the political personal or whatever, that, once these things really impact you on like a daily basis, then, that becomes that kind of interesting part about the reach. I remember when Obama was in office and somebody was talking about how, well, does it really affect you? Does the presidency really affect you at all? It's not like he's showing up at your office and handing you a sandwich. And, there was this kind of thing about the distance between Washington and the normal citizen, and this idea that people care so strongly about it. And the idea was that at the time, I remember hearing somebody just be like, this should not affect you this much. You should not be this bought into it. And I think there was a sort of, I don't know, it was sort of strange. It was like, you shouldn't care so much. And then when we have somebody like Trump show up, right, then it feels like there is a movement towards our duty is to care more. At least that's how I felt.
Well, again, I think it relates to how much it affects you personally.
Mm-hmm.
Because Stalin used to say that if 1 million people die, that's a statistic. If
Right.
one person dies, it's a tragedy. And in the book, there's the case of that Trump's going to tamp down on immigration a lot more than he did in his first term. And John, the major character that I just talked about previously, he says, well, Trump's bark is worse than his bite. The immigration is not going to, the immigration crackdown is not going to hurt us, until his cleaning lady, Rosita, is all of a sudden caught up in the immigration, is going to be deported. Then all of a sudden it's personal. Then it is a tragedy. And I think that's what happens, that the moment it impacts you personally, that's when you start to, when you go, if you're moderate, you either become very liberal or very conservative, because now it's affecting me personally.
Yeah, and that's seems like so a part of that is survival response and fear and having your life affected, and really sort of pulls us out of our bubbles or our echo chambers, right? Our little tribal groups all of a sudden become affected by these things, and I think you did a really good job in the book mapping that out on multiple points of view, right? Having people on the right, having people on the left, and there were points they would hit where they had to make decisions. You had to give up somebody. You had to give up your conscience. You had to like embrace your conscience, right? And it was these kind of, I think with the number of characters you had going through the book, it made it pretty compelling to sort of watch the dynamics play out. And then there were some arcs too. Some of the characters really changed. A few things came up and really surprised me, things I wasn't expecting. There were ways to push back against the president, but this moves us into the part of the book too, where due to the court systems, right? How we have these three systems for checks and balances, but when you sort of have a despot in one and you topple another one, and then one of them is full of people who are yes men, we turn into this completely other thing. Do you want to? I don't know, maybe get into how that could happen in reality. I mean, you mapped it out really well in your book.
Well, in terms of the decisions people make, and especially if you're working, if some decisions are easy, you want to buy a car and you got $30,000 in the bank, and you go and you buy a car. That's no decision. But there's a character in the book who's an inspector general for the Justice Department, and people start coming to him and saying, "Hey, there's a lot of illegal stuff going on," and they say, "We want you to do something." And on one hand, that's his job. That's what he should do. But in Trump's America, if he does his job and really starts to investigate, then he'll get fired. Mm-hmm. And so he's got to decide, is my conscience more important or is my job more important? And then complicating that is the fact that he could argue that even if he does something, A, it's not going to make any difference, and B, he'll only be fired. So, he can take a stand, but then it's not going to accomplish anything. So, those are the kind of tough decisions that people have to make, where if you make a decision, it could cost you your job. And that's difficult. So that was kind of the first part. The second part is in the courts, and what I liked about it was the fact that you have Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who at the time that I wrote this was still alive, who was in her, I think, 86 or something. I mean, she was old, and then you had Stephen Breyer, who's in his 80s, and what I predicted in my book, and some of this stuff actually came true, is that I said when Ruth Bader Ginsburg stepped down, and then she died shortly thereafter, I said that Trump would appoint a woman who would make Clarence Thomas look like a liberal.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened. It happened. And the other thing was that if Trump was in a second term, the chances are that Breyer was also going to be gone. And I predicted that Breyer was gone. He would have been placed by a white male Protestant. And the only difference that would have happened was, instead of him coming from Harvard or Yale, he would have come from Pennsylvania, Trump's alma mater. That would be the only difference. So then now the court's 6-3. If Trump had been elected for a second term, I predicted it would have been 7-2. And that has significant implications for what would happen on a lot of these decisions that are going to come to the courts. I mean, to a certain extent, it's surprising in the 6-3 court that they, out of 60 challenges to the election that Trump and the Republicans did, only one challenge was successful, and that was whether you could have observers, I think, 25 feet away or 5 feet away. Every other challenge, which shows you really how bad Trump's electoral challenges were, to have a court that's 6-3 conservative and have one out of 60 challenges be successful. That's how bad things were.
Yeah.
But the court would have significant implications if it goes if it ever went to 7-2. It's got significant implications at 6-3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and earlier when you mentioned that you could lose your job, for instance, right? You were talking about the inspector general, and there's something that you bring up in the book that we've seen play out, right? Where Trump goes after people on a personal level. Like he works to destroy the integrity of the person. He works to just completely destroy them, right? So there would be this instance where not only do you lose your job, but in Trump's America, then jobs would be harder and harder to come by. And so you end up sort of losing your livelihood. And the impossibility then of taking a stand is it's not just your job, it's your entire livelihood. You wouldn't be able to go out the next day and find another job. And so there becomes this kind of downward slide that starts happening. I think in the book, it sort of maps it out for the entire nation.
Well, it happens at two levels and two responses. One level is that Trump denigrates the character, the families of people such as Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, and you can either say no, this is not right. You can take a Romney stance, this is not right, or you can do what they become even more ardent supporters, which, God, I find that very hard to fathom. But at a personal level, and one of the things that I was trying to do in the book was take some average people, and like and actually these aren't average people. These were white upper middle class people living in good things, and their life doesn't become doesn't get better. It becomes worse, and this happens for a large segment of the population. And Trump's response to it is to appeal to the religious, the evangelicals and religious leaders, and say, no, you need to say that we need Trump, and Trump, of course, in his tweets would say, hey, things have never been better. I mean, you can defy reality. You can watching Trump's tweets during his election challenges, when he said, hey, there is massive, massive fraud, and everybody kept saying there's not one piece of evidence, and he said, yeah, there is. And you say, well, what's the evidence? He goes, well, the evidence is there's massive fraud. And you go, wait a minute, we're going around in circles. And so what happens is that Trump does convince some people, but over time, and in the second term, I think the resistance to Trump, and Trump's popularity was never above 40, 45, would get down in the 30s. But one of the things that's frightening, and I point out in the book, is once you're elected president, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get rid of the president. I mean, if a president can hold a rally in January, urge people to go out and fight and go to the Capitol and overturn the election and still not be impeached, and that is one of the most extreme things I've ever seen, then anything else, everything else is fair game and legitimate in his eyes.
Well, and it does the thing that a lot of people have talked about, which is delegitimate the entire position, right? I mean, it is more, interestingly enough, you keep shifting more and more power into the hands of this role, the presidential role. I think I've heard that this has been happening since the 80s, that they've been increasing the role of the president and his ability to access power. And so you finally get to this point where something like this can happen, and whatever used to be normal will never be normal again. So we've really taken a shift here, because at this point you can always point at Trump as something that happened, and it'll be interesting to see if this sort of, I don't know, respect and consideration is returned back to with somebody like Biden, where these sort of extremes are not being approached again, because there's of course a legal limit and then sort of a moral limit, and what we've kind of watched is that those limits are all just blown straight through with Trump, and so what used to be the norm is completely shifted now.
Yeah, I think, and the good news is I think Trump was an aberration
Hmm.
in many respects, and a kind of a cult of personality that this country has never seen, and kind of his kind of ignoring norms and civility and respect and everything else. I mean, nobody, no other president has done that. But at the same time, the country has become so divided and so polarized that it's going to be tough for anybody. And and I look at the two votes in Congress. One was in the House voting, whether to certify the election or not. There were still more Republican congressmen, who voted not to certify the election, and without one shred of evidence. So that's a polarization. And
Hmm.
then the other polarization was, when you looked at Biden's stimulus bill that was passed, it was passed one without one Republican vote. I mean, look, I can understand that 75% of Republicans don't support it, but 100% not support it. I mean, that polarization, and that's continuing on everything. A lot of Biden's nominees, unless they have some support, a lot of them are, kind of 50 to 49.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's just team-based stuff. It has very little to do with, it seems like, reality. And I've often heard that we're in a time of just consensus politics, and it doesn't really matter who's in office, Democrat or Republican. They're all just the same basically anyway. And you kind of hear these things, and then we go through a presidency with somebody like Trump, and you just go, well, maybe not, right? You can see how that shifts. And I guess I'd like to take us into a second part here, which are these real world precedents for these kind of things happening. And of course, you touch on Russia a little bit, and Russia is a sort of prime example with Putin and his ability to not sort of participate in the rules of an election until all of a sudden he's just de facto the authoritarian of the nation.
Well, within authoritarian regimes, there is such control of everything that the opposition in Russia and Navalny is imprisoned. Putin suspends the Constitution and says, "Hey, I can rule as long as I want to." In the U.S., we have the 22nd Amendment. Although in my book, there's a question about whether the 22nd Amendment, whether the president can run for a third term, comes into question. But the fact is that Trump had an affinity for Putin, which defied logic, defied rationality, and in fact, that picture of Trump standing next to Putin, and Putin says, "No, I didn't interfere with the election," and even though our whole intelligence service said, "Yeah, he did," and Russia did, uh, so that I think that was very troublesome. His relationship with Russia. The uh, the other thing was that one of the things you get in authoritarian regimes, and what makes them tick, is the support of the military.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, I think Trump went too far in 2020 when he did that holding up the Bible, and the military was kind of backing him up, and that's something you see in banana republics. And Milley, who is the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he said, yeah, that probably wasn't our best move. We shouldn't have done that. But in a Trump second term, as in the book, I think Trump would have said, hey, the people back me. I have absolute rule, and I'm going to, and the logical extension of what I did in the first term, I'm going to do in the second term only more. And I think that would have been extremely troublesome vis-a-vis authoritarian rule and the military.
Yeah, I agree completely. And his fascination with Putin just reminded me that it would be very easy to get. I read Timothy Snyder's The Road to Unfreedom, and book, he's really mapping out what happens between the Ukraine and Russia and how they would just continue to lie about things. They'd invade and then say that they didn't invade and say, actually, as a matter of fact, the Ukraine attacked us. And so you see these kind of loops, and then you sort of watch what Donald Trump was doing at the same time and throughout his first term, and you just think that if his power was more solidified in some way, if he did have more military buy-in, if he did have the courts, if he did, then you just sort of see that, yeah, it would be very easy for him to just start shifting things along the same way Putin did. And you just start having mock trials, right? It's almost like everything becomes a Potemkin village, and it would just be really difficult to, I think, to at some point pull him back out of there. And that was one of the things you touched on in the book too, is like when they get into a certain level of power and everyone's getting hurt, then how hard is it to pry this person out? And you mentioned that earlier. It's very difficult to get rid of a president.
The you know the founders of the nation purposely made it difficult because you didn't want presidents removed capriciously. But at the same time, I don't think they anticipated or they foresaw a presidency like Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And but in the book, I look at different ways that people have of removing presidents. There's legislatively, which would mean that you want to curtail the president's power, but that assumes that you would have uh, a Democratic House and Senate. And if President Trump were reelected a second time, not only would he have had the courts, he would have had the presidency, but chances are he would have had the Senate too, because the two Georgia senators would probably have been Republican. So you look legislatively would have been tough. The 25th Amendment is you got to get 10, you got to get 8 cabinet members, the president pro tempore, and the vice president all to back it. And, and all these people owe their livelihood and they owe their prominence and their power to Trump. So, first of all, that would have been next to impossible. And then, second, the president can say, okay, I don't agree with this, and then could have gone to the Congress and would have needed 2/3 of the Congress to agree that he should be removed. So, and then you get assassination, and the assassination attempts, the last assassination that went through was McKinley. I mean, you had Roosevelt was attempted to assassinate Reagan, but none of that's very difficult. And there are other things that you can try, but it is so difficult to get rid of the president. And even as a liberal, you're saying, do you really want it? Because you probably want it that difficult, because of the potential pernicious implications of then, the other side then say wants to get rid of a Biden or wants to get rid of an Obama, and you don't want to make it too easy.
Well, yeah, and there's this thing that has happened with our nation as well. Since the technology's increased, then it seems like everything needs to happen quicker and faster in time and speed. And we, our tendency to sort of, I don't know, postpone things seems harder and harder. It seems like our emotions get riled easier, and there's a lot of kind of things that happen with technology. And of course, can say that our emotions are riled easier, but then I think when you look back in history, there are some presidents who caused a lot of consternation, and you know, so maybe that's not actually true at all. On occasion, I start blaming a lot of things on technology, but it's probably not true. We were probably always politically divisive in certain camps, and there's probably also always the need to push somebody out. Um, and I guess that's why we have 4 years. I think that's kind of an interesting cycle to be in. Is it's enough time to make some changes, but not enough time, hopefully, to break anything too bad.
Well, I think that there always have been very hotly contested elections and bitter rivalries. So I don't think that has changed, but I think that what has changed is the technology and the immediacy that you have with Twitter, with YouTube, with the internet. That as you look at the George Floyd thing, they were saying that the two things that made this different were that you had the video, and then you had that posted online, and if you look at a lot of Trump's power and compare him post Twitter with pre Twitter, you know before Trump's Twitter posts used to dominate the news cycle, and now you do hear about him, but it's a fraction. So technology has made things more immediate, more pervasive, and I think the 4 year limit is important, and while I don't necessarily back court packing, I do think you need court. You do need term limits for like
Mm-hmm.
Supreme Court justices.
Yeah. It's it's also, yeah, with some of them getting much older, then all of a sudden everything starts to become precarious based on which president you have in power, and that's also kind of difficult. The speaking of Twitter, I think one of the things you did that was so great in the book was, you have a few speeches by Trump, but you don't spend a lot of time sort of trying to embody Trump. It was mostly embodied through his tweeting, and I love that. I love that layer that these are just these kind of superficial, mass blown out things that he's just saying, and is so full of, I don't know, his way of speaking is so crazy, and how you sort of embodied that was also really fascinating. But that this is a super, what I consider is kind of a superficial means of communication on a superficial platform. Yet it was, and I think that sort of understates the way that the entire presidency was operated. You know, but his ability to sort of put those things out, and your way of using that in the book to showcase what was going on and how things moved forward, and sort of continually embody this kind of what I would consider like a ridiculousness, was really amazing.
Well, I wanted to have fun with the book too,
Yeah.
and in having fun, I figured, what's the major way that Trump communicates? It's through 140 characters, and therefore, when he said I'm going to declare a national emergency, he wouldn't go to Congress, he wouldn't make a speech, he'd do a Twitter post saying I'm going to declare emergency. And in fact, one of the things I did on the back of my book is, and I do this in the Twitter format, is I said, this book, referring to my book, this book is fake news, pure trash. I would never abolish Obamacare, use troops to control protests, or promote misformation. Authors should be shamed. Don't buy this book. And that's exactly what Trump would do. There's, I bolded a few parts. And somebody said, well, wait a minute, Tom, you did that wrong. It's not misformation. You spelled it wrong. It's misinformation. And I said, yeah, exactly, because that's what Trump does. He misspells things, and that's how he gets back at critics.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's yeah, it was really great. it was just these moments of sort of like it's like a really dark levity when you're going through and a chapter opens and you get to read like a Trump tweet and you're just like, oh man, you kind of smack your forehead. And there was like a release though, right? Because reading through the book, then you can see how things would get super dark and just get worse and worse for a lot of people. And then these kind of tweets would show up and you would just start laughing because they're so insane. And so I kind of enjoyed that, but it was also the reality that we very easily could have been in right now.
Oh, it's the pandemic was rampant. People were dying, and Trump saying, "Hey, things are fine. We've got it under control. I've got my A rating," and it is so crazy and so counter. I mean, with the election result, it is so counter anything. But at the end of the day, this book is frightening when you realize how close we came to potentially having Trump, be reelected. And as you go through the book, I think in terms of a lot of things, we dodged a we as a country dodged a bullet.
Yeah. And, we're going to need to wrap this up soon, but you have China features very prominently in the book as well. And we haven't had time to really get into that, but that's just one more example of something else like a relationship that might possibly be repaired in some ways so that we can, I don't know, there's so many implications that happen when you start messing with other countries like that.
Well, to China is a tough case, and because they do steal some of our intellectual capital. They do have they do persecute Muslims in Western China, the Uyghurs, and it is an authoritarian regime. So there's a lot that's tough about it, but it's a superpower, and we need to kind of learn to live with them. And I think Trump was kind of always at odds, and they were at odds with him. But it's something that hopefully Biden can can get a better relationship, and I think part of that is part of the worldview that under Obama and under Biden, we want to get alliances, we want to have support. Trump's America first. We're going to we're going to do whatever we want to do and screw the rest of the world. I think that puts us at a huge disadvantage. And I'm hoping that's where, and from what I've seen, Biden is repairing some of those alliances that have been damaged during the Trump years and which would only get worse. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, and there's a lot of things to be. There are a lot of positives and negatives about globalization overall, but I'm not sure that retreating into nationalism is exactly the right path to take, and so I think there has to be alternate ways to repair some of these things that don't include, I don't know, withdrawing from the global economy or like basically skipping over the UN entirely. These kind of things where we're just on our own, playing by our own game. I just don't know if that works anymore.
well, no, and it was crazy then, and it's crazy now, and we are reaching out to a lot of to repair a lot of those relationships. And at the same time, we're confronting Russia, which we need to, and with Iran, we need to confront them too. And I think Biden's taking a more measured approach and wants to build support, and I think that's the key thing. Going it alone, even if you're right, not a winning formula. Going it as a world community gives you a certain legitimacy and a certain strength that I think is necessary.
Yeah. Well, Tom, this has been fantastic. I could keep going down rabbit holes all day about weird stuff related to Trump, but yeah, is there anything you would like to sort of finish up on?
I, you know, this book was a, I enjoyed writing it. And at the same time I enjoyed writing it, it became a little bit scary. And I had some friends that said, no, I don't want to read it. We've had enough of Trump. But I think it is instructive in the same way that when you get Philip Roth's book, The Plot Against America, the book that was on one of the network, one of the streaming services, Man in the High Castle, that there is a dangerous, and we need to treasure, kind of the democracy, and that's why the January 6th thing was so horrendous. And what concerns me is that the Congress is attempting to investigate, and some of the Republicans saying, well, we're only going to investigate January 6th if we can go back and investigate what happened in 2020 with the protests during the summer. And I'm saying, wait a minute, guys, let's focus in on the greatest threat to our country and democracy, and that was the January 6th rebellion. The other greatest threat would have been Trump's second term. Yeah. And so, that's look, the book's available on Amazon, and it's a good read, but fasten your seatbelt.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, well, Tom, thank you very much for your time, and we'll keep in touch. And once again, just really hope the book does fantastically. I read it in one day. Just for anybody listening out there, it's very easy to get into, and I just kind of burned through it. It was very engaging.
Thanks very much, Ryder. I appreciate your time.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye. All right, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I finished reading Tom's book in a day, and I found the intricacies and the complications intriguing, as well as how he would predict that things would pan out. The book is, of course, available on Amazon, and we have a link to it on our website at letusthinkaboutit.com. And of course, if you enjoyed the show, help us out with a rating, review, or a monthly donation. Until next time, stay safe.